For privacy reasons, names and places have been changed. This story is inspired by true events.
On the morning of March 12, 2002, 24-year-old Hannah Edwards left her volunteer house in Kathmandu's bustling Tamil district, heading for the ancient Swayambhunath temple. She never arrived. Despite an extensive search operation across Nepal's capital, involving both local police and British embassy officials, Hannah vanished without a trace, leaving behind a room untouched and a community baffled. For 18 years, her family in Birmingham lived with agonizing uncertainty, clinging to hope while fearing the worst. Then, in 2020, during renovations at a local monastery, a discovery was made that would finally break open one of Nepal's most haunting mysteries. This is the complete investigation into what happened to Hannah Edwards, and how a young woman's quest to embrace Buddhist culture led her into the darkest corners of Kathmandu's underworld. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this content, consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Now let's continue. In the crisp morning air of March 15, 2002, Hannah Edwards stepped out of her volunteer quarters in Kathmandu's bustling Tamil district for what should have been a routine day trip. The 24-year-old from Birmingham had spent the past 3 months teaching English to local children, embracing Nepal's rich cultural heritage while pursuing her lifelong fascination with Buddhist philosophy. That morning, Hannah had carefully planned her visit to Swayambhunath Temple, known to tourists as the Monkey Temple. She packed her day bag with a water bottle, her cherished camera, and a small notebook where she diligently recorded her experiences. Fellow volunteer Sarah Thompson recalled Hannah's excitement about photographing the sunrise over the temple's golden spires. The vibrant streets of Tamil were already alive with activity as Hannah made her way through the narrow alleyways. Street vendors called out their morning greetings, and the air filled with the familiar scent of incense and freshly brewed chai. Hannah stopped briefly at her usual breakfast spot, where owner Ram Bahadur later remembered her ordering milk tea and sell roti, appearing relaxed and cheerful. By midday, when Hannah hadn't returned to the volunteer house for lunch, no one was particularly concerned. It was common for volunteers to extend their temple visits, often losing track of time while exploring the surrounding monasteries or engaging in meditation sessions. But as afternoon faded into evening, an unsettling quiet descended over the volunteer community. Hannah's room remained exactly as she had left it that morning, her bed neatly made, a half-read novel on the nightstand, and her weekly lesson plan spread across the desk. Her passport and most of her belongings stayed untouched, suggesting she had planned to return. A small calendar on her wall showed carefully marked teaching schedules and upcoming trek plans, including a planned visit to Everest Base Camp the following month. When darkness fell and Hannah still hadn't returned, her fellow volunteers raised the alarm. The volunteer coordinator, Mary Chen, contacted the local police station, but the initial response was tepid. Young tourists frequently went off-grid in Nepal, authorities explained, often embarking on unplanned treks or extending their stays at meditation retreats without notice. The next morning, as concern mounted, volunteers organized search parties around Swayambhunath. They showed Hannah's photograph to monks, shopkeepers, and other visitors, but no one could definitively remember seeing her. The temple's guest book bore no trace of her signature, though hundreds of visitors had passed through that day. By the third day, the British embassy became involved, and Councillor Sarah Mitchell arrived at the volunteer house to coordinate with local authorities. Lieutenant Pradeep Rana took charge of the investigation, marking the beginning of what would become one of Kathmandu's most perplexing missing persons cases. Hannah's disappearance sent shockwaves through Kathmandu's tight-knit expatriate community. The Tamil district, usually a haven for backpackers and spiritual seekers, suddenly felt different. Volunteers began traveling in groups, and the carefree atmosphere that had drawn so many young people to Nepal took on a darker tone. As days turned into weeks, Hannah's room remained untouched, becoming a time capsule of a life suddenly interrupted. Her last entry in the volunteer house logbook read simply, "Off to Swayampuneth, early want to catch the morning prayers. Back for afternoon classes." Those classes would never take place, and her students at the local school would gather daily at the window, watching hopefully for their teacher's return. The initial investigation focused on the obvious, the temple complex, surrounding areas, and possible trekking routes. But Hannah had vanished completely, leaving no trace of her movements after she was last seen in Thamel that morning. No one could have predicted that the truth would remain hidden for 18 years, concealed within the walls of a monastery, waiting to reveal a story far more sinister than anyone had imagined. As the reality of Hannah Edwards' disappearance settled over Kathmandu, Lieutenant Pradeep Rana arrived at the volunteer house on a humid March morning. A veteran of Nepal's police force, Rana had investigated numerous missing tourist cases, but something about Hannah's disappearance immediately struck him as different. The methodical organization of her room, her detailed planning, and her commitment to her students all painted a picture of someone unlikely to vanish voluntarily. British Embassy Counselor Sarah Mitchell joined the investigation team, establishing a crucial link between local authorities and Hannah's increasingly frantic family in Birmingham. Mitchell's presence added diplomatic weight to the case, ensuring resources were allocated to what might otherwise have been dismissed as another backpacker gone astray. The first week of investigation centered on Swayampuneth Temple and its surroundings. Teams combed through every corner of the ancient complex, questioning monks and local vendors. Security camera footage from nearby businesses proved frustratingly limited. Most cameras were either broken or recorded over their footage every 48 hours. Hannah's fellow volunteers provided detailed statements, building a comprehensive picture of her final days. They described her as focused and enthusiastic about her teaching work, showing no signs of depression or desire to leave. Her recent phone calls home had been positive, filled with plans for upcoming projects and her anticipated trek to Everest Base Camp. Lieutenant Rana's attention soon turned to the Blue Mountain Guest House, where Hannah had lived since arriving in Kathmandu. The owner, Karma Sherpa, presented himself as helpful and concerned, providing police with Hannah's registration documents and volunteering information about her daily routines. He mentioned her regular temple visits, but claimed no special knowledge of her movements on the day she vanished. The investigation team meticulously examined Hannah's room, photographing every detail. Her laptop contained recent email correspondence with her family, lesson plans, and research about Buddhist temples. Her bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and her credit cards remained unused after her disappearance. A half-written letter to her sister lay on her desk, describing her plans to extend her stay in Nepal for another 6 months. As March turned to April, the search expanded. Police distributed flyers throughout Kathmandu Valley, featuring Hannah's photograph and details in both English and Nepali. Local newspapers carried the story, and British media began picking up on the case of the vanished volunteer. But despite the increased attention, solid leads remained elusive. Sarah Mitchell coordinated with international agencies, checking border crossings and regional transportation hubs. No trace of Hannah's movement appeared in any official records. Her passport had never left her room, making international travel seemingly impossible. The investigation began to face the challenging reality that Hannah might never have reached Swayampuneth Temple that morning. Lieutenant Rana's interviews extended to the broader Thamel community. Street vendors, taxi drivers, and shopkeepers were questioned repeatedly. A fruit seller recalled seeing Hannah that morning, describing her as walking purposefully toward the temple, but after that sighting, her trail went cold. The busy streets of Thamel, usually so helpful in providing witnesses, had somehow swallowed all traces of her presence. By the end of April, the initial burst of investigative activity began to slow. The daily searches became weekly, then monthly. Hannah's room remained sealed, her belongings untouched. Ed waiting for her return. Lieutenant Rana kept the case file on his desk, refusing to relegate it to the growing stack of unsolved disappearances, but even he had to admit they were running out of leads to pursue. The British Embassy maintained regular contact with Hannah's family, but each update became more difficult as they had less news to share. The investigation had reached that frustrating phase where every possible thread had been pulled, every obvious angle explored, and still, Hannah Edwards remained as missing as she had been that first evening when she failed to return from her temple visit. What no one could know then was that the true story of Hannah's disappearance lay hidden just meters from where they searched, concealed behind the respectable facade of a guesthouse owner who had watched the investigation unfold with calculated interest, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. As spring faded into summer, the search for Hannah Edwards gradually slipped from newspaper headlines. The once bustling investigation room at Kathmandu's police headquarters grew quieter, and the daily briefings became weekly updates, then monthly mentions. Lieutenant Pradeep Rana found himself increasingly isolated in his determination to keep the case active, watching as other officers were reassigned to newer, more pressing investigations. In Birmingham, Hannah's family maintained their desperate vigil. Her mother Janet transformed their living room into an impromptu command center, walls covered with maps of Nepal and timelines of Hannah's last known movements. Every morning, she checked her email hoping for news, only to face another day of silence. Her father Michael took extended leave from his accounting job, making 3 trips to Kathmandu that year, each time returning with more questions than answers. The volunteer community in Thamel changed as well. New arrivals were now given detailed safety briefings, and the once common solo excursions to temples became strictly regulated group activities. Hannah's empty room at the Blue Mountain guest house was eventually cleared out, her belongings carefully packed and shipped back to England. Only her photographs remained on the community bulletin board, slowly fading in the harsh Nepalese sun. British media interest waned predictably. The initial flurry of coverage, with its dramatic headlines about the missing volunteer, gave way to brief mentions on anniversaries. Newspaper clippings in the Edwards family album tracked this decline from front-page features to small columns on inside pages, until Hannah became just another statistic in the global database of missing persons. By 2003, the investigation had exhausted every conventional avenue. Lieutenant Rana's case files grew thick with dead-end leads and unconfirmed sightings. A woman matching Hannah's description in Pokhara turned out to be an Australian tourist. A supposed sighting in a remote monastery led nowhere. Each false hope further demoralized the dwindling team of investigators. The British Embassy's involvement, once so prominent through Councillor Sarah Mitchell's daily presence, gradually reduced to periodic check-ins. Mitchell, who had formed a close bond with Hannah's family, found herself making those dreaded calls with increasing infrequency, having nothing new to report. The embassy's missing persons file for Hannah Edwards moved from active status to long-term unsolved. Years passed, and Kathmandu itself began to forget. New volunteers arrived at the schools where Hannah had taught, her students graduated, and the city's relentless pace of life continued. The local shopkeepers who had once eagerly assisted police could no longer recall the specific details of that March morning. Even the fruit seller who had provided the last confirmed sighting eventually relocated, taking with him vital first-hand knowledge of Hannah's final movements. Tourism in Nepal faced new challenges: political unrest, natural disasters, changing travel patterns, and the story of one missing British volunteer became obscured by fresher tragedies. The Blue Mountain Guest House continued operating under Karma Sherpa's management, its reputation untarnished by its connection to the case. Karma himself became a respected figure in Thamel's business community, his helpful demeanor during the investigation having enhanced his standing. Lieutenant Rana, though officially assigned to other cases, never fully abandoned the search for Hannah. Every few months, he would revisit the files, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previously overlooked. He maintained sporadic contact with the Edwards family, sharing their frustration as years of investigation yielded nothing but theories and suppositions. By 2020, Hannah's case had been cold for 18 years. Her parents had aged beyond their years, marked by grief and uncertainty. Her younger sister Emily, now older than Hannah had been when she disappeared, carried on the family's search through social media and online forums, refusing to let her sister's memory fade completely. The official file, thick with witness statements and false leads, gathered dust in the archives of Kathmandu's police headquarters. Its pages told the story of an investigation that had once commanded the attention of two nations, but now sat dormant, waiting for the breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. No one could have predicted that the truth lay silently preserved within the walls of a monastery, hidden in the pages of a journal that would finally bring to light the dark reality behind Hannah Edwards' disappearance. The answers had been there all along, waiting to be discovered in the very community where she had vanished, concealed by the everyday rhythms of life in Thamel. In the early spring of 2020, as dawn broke over Swayambhunath Temple, a team of renovation workers began the delicate task of restoring the monastery's aging eastern wing. The project, funded by a Buddhist preservation society, aimed to reinforce the ancient structure's crumbling walls. None of the workers could have anticipated that their routine restoration work would finally unlock the mystery of Hannah Edwards' disappearance. Behind a loose stone in the monastery's meditation hall, worker Pemba Tamang discovered a weathered leather journal wedged deep within the wall cavity. The book's pages, though yellowed with age, remained remarkably preserved in the dry mountain air. Written in neat English script, the name Hannah Edwards was inscribed on the inside cover, dated March 2002. The monastery's head monk, recognizing the significance of the name, immediately contacted Lieutenant Pradeep Rana, who had never fully retired from the police force. Within hours, Rana arrived at the temple, his hands trembling as he carefully opened the journal that might finally provide answers to the case that had haunted him for 18 years. Hannah's writings revealed a darker story than anyone had imagined. The early entries described her enthusiasm for teaching and her deep connection to Nepal's spiritual culture. But by late February 2002, the tone of her writing changed dramatically. She documented increasing harassment from Karma Sherpa, the owner of Blue Mountain Guest House, describing how he would appear unexpectedly outside her classroom and follow her during her walks through Thamel. More disturbing were Hannah's detailed observations of suspicious activities at the guest house. She wrote about young female travelers who would suddenly disappear after accepting tea from Karma, only to be quietly moved in the middle of the night. Her entries grew increasingly anxious as she pieced together the reality of what she was witnessing, a trafficking operation that preyed on vulnerable backpackers. The final entries revealed Hannah's growing terror. She had confronted Karma with her discoveries, threatening to report him to the British authorities. His response, according to her last entry dated March 14, had been chilling. "He smiled at me today in a way that made my blood run cold," she wrote. "Said I should be careful about spreading stories. Said accidents happen to nosy foreigners in Nepal all the time." Hannah's last written words indicated her plan to hide the journal in the monastery, where she felt it would be safe. She knew the danger she faced but remained determined to expose the truth. "If anything happens to me," she wrote, "this journal will tell the real story. Karma Sherpa is not who he pretends to be." The discovery sent shockwaves through Kathmandu's law enforcement community. The journal provided not just an account of Hannah's final days, but detailed evidence of a trafficking operation that had potentially claimed numerous victims over 2 decades. Names, dates, and overheard conversations filled the pages, painting a picture of systematic exploitation hidden behind the respectable facade of a tea or risk guest house. For Hannah's family in Birmingham, the journal's discovery brought both closure and fresh anguish. The pages revealed their daughter's courage in the face of growing danger, but also confirmed their worst fears about her fate. Janet Edwards, reading her daughter's words for the first time, recognized the same determination that had always characterized Hannah's approach to injustice. The journal's final pages contained something even more crucial: a hand-drawn map marking specific locations around the guest house property, along with a cryptic note about where they keep them before India. This detail would prove vital in the renewed investigation that followed, leading authorities to hidden rooms and eventually to the grim truth about Hannah's disappearance. As news of the journal's discovery spread through Thamel, the atmosphere in the tourist district grew tense. Longtime residents recalled other disappearances that had been dismissed as travelers moving on, while former guest house employees began coming forward with their own stories of suspicious activities they had witnessed over the years. Hannah's journal had survived 18 years hidden within the monastery walls, its pages preserving not just the truth about her disappearance, but evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity in the heart of Kathmandu's tourist district. The young volunteer's final act of courage, preserving her discoveries in those hidden pages, would finally bring to light the dark secrets that had claimed her life. The discovery of Hannah's journal in 2020 galvanized the Nepal police into immediate action. Lieutenant Pradeep Rana, though nearing retirement, took personal command of the reopened investigation, working from the same desk where Hannah's original case file had haunted him for 18 years. Within days, a dedicated task force assembled in a converted conference room at police headquarters. The walls quickly filled with photographs, timelines, and maps, all centered around the Blue Mountain Guest House and its owner, Karma Sherpa. Yellowing missing persons reports from the past 2 decades were retrieved from archives, each one scrutinized for potential connections to Karma's operation. Tenzin Norbu, a renowned expert in trafficking investigations, joined the team as a special consultant. His experience with cross-border trafficking networks between Nepal and India proved invaluable as they began mapping the patterns described in Hannah's journal. The methodology was sophisticated, Norbu explained during early briefings. Using a legitimate business as cover, targeting solo female travelers, establishing trust before exploitation, these are hallmarks of well-organized trafficking operations. The investigation team meticulously cross-referenced Hannah's journal entries with immigration records, revealing a disturbing pattern. Dozens of young women who had checked into the Blue Mountain Guest House between 2000 and 2020 had never officially checked out or left Nepal. Their disappearances, previously dismissed as typical backpacker behavior, now took on sinister significance. Surveillance teams established observation points around Karma's current operations. Though he had sold the original guest house years earlier, he maintained ownership of several properties in Thamel. Cameras documented a steady stream of young travelers entering his establishments, while carefully orchestrated nighttime movements suggested his operation had evolved but never ceased. Former employees of the Blue Mountain Guest House, protected by promises of immunity, began sharing their stories. A former housekeeper described secret rooms beneath the property where women were held. A night watchman admitted to helping load unconscious guests into vehicles during pre-dawn hours, believing at the time they were merely intoxicated tourists being taken to hospitals. The investigation expanded to include financial tracking. Years of bank records revealed complex money transfers between Kathmandu and various Indian cities, carefully disguised as tourist service payments. British embassy staff, led by a new generation of diplomats, but drawing on Sarah Mitchell's detailed records from 2002, provided crucial support in tracking international banking connections. As evidence mounted, the team uncovered the full scope of Karma's network. Hannah's journal had documented only the beginning of an operation that had grown into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Her detailed observations of guest movements, suspicious behaviors, and overheard conversations provided investigators with a foundation for understanding how the network had evolved. Local monastery records proved crucial in corroborating Hannah's timeline. Monks remembered her frequent visits in early 2002, noting her increasing agitation in the weeks before her disappearance. One elderly monk recalled her final visit, describing how she had lingered in the meditation hall where her journal would later be discovered. The investigation team worked methodically, building an airtight case before moving against Karma. They knew from Hannah's journal that he was capable of violence when threatened, and his 2 decades of successful operation suggested powerful protectors. Every piece of evidence was carefully documented and verified, leaving no room for legal challenges. Through it all, Hannah's voice echoed from the pages of her journal, guiding investigators toward the truth she had died trying to expose. Her detailed accounts of Karma's operation, written in the weeks before her death, proved remarkably accurate. The trafficking routes she had identified remained active, the methods of drugging and transport unchanged, the network of collaborators still largely intact. As spring turned to summer in 2020, the investigation reached a critical phase. Surveillance teams reported increased activity at Karma's properties, suggesting he might be aware of the renewed scrutiny. The decision to move against him would have to come soon, before he could destroy evidence or flee the country. The truth about Hannah Edwards' final days was finally within reach, but bringing her killer to justice would require perfect timing and irrefutable evidence. As monsoon rains pounded Kathmandu in July 2020, Lieutenant Pradeep Rana made the decision to confront Karma Sherpa directly. The evidence gathered from Hannah's journal, combined with months of surveillance and financial investigations, had created an insurmountable case against the former guesthouse owner. On a humid morning, Karma sat in the same interrogation room where he had once played the role of helpful witness in Hannah's disappearance. Now aged 59, his carefully maintained facade of respectability had begun to crack under the weight of evidence presented before him. The transformation was subtle at first, a slight tremor in his hands, a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Lieutenant Rana placed Hannah's journal on the table between them. The leather-bound book, its pages now carefully preserved and documented, represented everything Karma had worked to hide for 18 years. As Rana began reading Hannah's detailed accounts of his threats, Karma's composure crumbled visibly. The breakthrough came when investigators revealed their knowledge of the underground rooms beneath the original guest house. Hannah's map, sketched hastily in her final days, had led them to discover structural modifications that could only have been made for concealment. Former employees had confirmed their use as temporary holding cells for trafficked women. Faced with Hannah's written testimony and overwhelming physical evidence, Karma's resistance finally broke. His confession emerged in fragments, each admission more chilling than the last. He described how Hannah had grown suspicious of his operation, watching him too closely, asking too many questions. When she threatened to expose him, he realized she had become a liability that threatened 2 decades of carefully built criminal enterprise. The details of Hannah's final hours emerged with brutal clarity. Karma recounted how he had followed her that morning, not toward Swayambhunath temple as witnesses believed, but to a secluded area behind the guest house. Her final moments came quickly, a single violent act meant to silence a threat to his operation. He had buried her remains on his property, later constructing a storage shed over the site to hide any evidence. As Karma's confession continued, the full scope of his trafficking network unfolded. Hannah had been right about everything: the drugged tea, the midnight transportations, the connections to Indian brothels. Her detailed documentation had exposed a criminal enterprise that had victimized countless young women over 2 decades. The investigation team moved quickly to secure the location Karma identified. Beneath the weathered floorboards of a storage shed, forensic experts discovered Hannah's remains, along with her camera and the day pack she had carried that morning in 2002. The physical evidence matched every detail from her journal, validating her final written words and providing irrefutable proof of Karma's guilt. News of the discovery spread rapidly through Kathmandu's expatriate community. Veteran volunteers remembered Hannah's disappearance, while newer arrivals were shocked to learn that such darkness had lurked behind Thamel's friendly exterior. The British Embassy, which had maintained Hannah's case file for 18 years, began the solemn process of helping her family arrange final rites. In Birmingham, the Edwards family received closure they had almost stopped hoping for. Hannah's father, Michael, now in his 70s, spoke softly of his daughter's courage in facing evil, while her mother, Janet, found solace in knowing Hannah's final act had been to protect others from harm. Lieutenant Rana, standing in the rain as forensic teams worked, reflected on the young volunteer whose disappearance had haunted his career. Hannah's journal had done more than solve her own murder. It had exposed a criminal network, saved countless potential victims, and brought long-delayed justice to a quiet corner of Kathmandu. The aftermath of Hannah Edwards' case transformed Kathmandu's approach to volunteer safety and human trafficking prevention. In the months following Karma Sherpa's confession, authorities uncovered the full extent of his operation, identifying over 60 women who had disappeared through his network since 1998. The investigation sparked a complete overhaul of guesthouse regulations throughout Nepal's tourist districts. Hannah's remains were finally returned to Birmingham in October 2020, accompanied by her recovered belongings and the journal that had exposed her killer. The funeral service, held in the same church where she had once taught Sunday school, drew hundreds of mourners, including former volunteers who had known her in Nepal and others who had been moved by her story. Lieutenant Pradeep Rana attended the service, carrying with him the weight of an 18-year investigation. He watched as Janet Edwards clutched her daughter's journal, now a testament to both tragedy and triumph. The lieutenant had kept his promise to find answers, though the truth had taken nearly 2 decades to emerge. The case prompted immediate changes in Nepal's volunteer program protocols. Background checks for guesthouse owners became mandatory, and new safety measures required regular check-ins for solo travelers. The British Embassy in Kathmandu established a dedicated volunteer support unit, named the Hannah Edwards Initiative, to monitor the welfare of young travelers and coordinate with local authorities. In the Thamel district, the Blue Mountain Guest House was permanently closed. The building was later converted into a women's shelter and advocacy center, its walls now adorned with photographs of Hannah and other victims of trafficking. The center provided support services and education, ensuring that Hannah's legacy would continue to protect vulnerable women. The investigation's ripple effects reached far beyond Nepal's borders. International police cooperation led to the dismantling of trafficking networks across South Asia. Karma's confession provided crucial intelligence about routes, methods, and collaborators, leading to dozens of arrests in India and beyond. Each discovery validated Hannah's initial suspicions and the careful observations she had recorded in her journal. Sarah Mitchell, the former British Embassy counselor who had first worked on Hannah's case, emerged from retirement to help establish new protocols for missing persons investigations in Nepal. Her experience with Hannah's case shaped training programs for diplomatic staff across the region, emphasizing the importance of persistent investigation and international cooperation. Hannah's students, now adults with children of their own, organized an annual scholarship in her memory at the school where she had taught. Each year, young women received educational opportunities that embodied Hannah's commitment to learning and cross-cultural understanding. Her photograph hung in the school's main hall, reminding new generations of her courage and sacrifice. The Edwards family channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing a foundation to support families of missing persons and combat human trafficking. Janet Edwards, speaking at international conferences, shared Hannah's story as a catalyst for change in tourist safety and criminal investigation procedures. Her daughter's journal became a powerful teaching tool for law enforcement agencies studying trafficking patterns. Lieutenant Rana, in his final act before retirement, compiled a comprehensive report on the case that became required reading at Nepal's police academy. The document detailed how Hannah's careful documentation, preserved in a hidden journal, had provided the key to unraveling a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. In the monastery where Hannah's journal had waited 18 years to be discovered, monks added her name to their daily prayers. The meditation hall where she had hidden her final testimony became a quiet reminder of truth's persistence and justice's long arc. Visitors to Swayambhunath Temple now passed a small plaque commemorating her courage in confronting evil at the cost of her own life. The resolution of Hannah Edwards' case marked more than the end of a murder investigation. It represented the triumph of patient justice, the power of written words to reach across time, and the lasting impact of one young woman's determination to expose truth. In death, as in life, Hannah had served as a protector of the vulnerable, her final act ensuring that countless others would be spared the fate she had suffered in the spring of 2002.